Late one night, I found myself in a strange moment of solitude, completely unaware of the quiet laughter and curious glances aimed right at me. Their amusement wasn't over some awkward position I'd stumbled into, but something far more personal and shocking. I was embarrassingly the last to realize it. Apparently, it was wildly funny to them that I had been blissfully clueless about what had been going on right under my nose. How could a man miss his own wife's infidelity? That's exactly what Ethan Holloway, who, it seemed, knew my wife very well, was explaining to his buddy Liam Preston. He bragged about seducing her at a party just the week before. While this was going on, I'd been called to investigate a break-in at a local art gallery. I was out for a couple of hours, long enough, it turned out, for him to put his plan into action. When I got back later that evening, there she was, sitting at a table with Ethan, his boss, and their spouses as if nothing had happened. For a little context, my name's Lucas Hayes, and I work as an insurance investigator. I've been with a well-known firm that handles high-value property claims for a solid 15 years, ever since I graduated college. At 37, I'd say I'm in my prime, especially when it comes to my work. My job involves digging into incidents that could lead to big insurance payouts, usually thefts, robberies, and multi-vehicle accidents. I've earned a solid reputation in the business and sometimes get contracted by other companies willing to pay top dollar for my expertise. Even though I'm on the road a lot, my trips are rarely lengthy. If something big needs a longer presence, I've got a team that can step in to handle it. I've been married to Lila for 14 years, and we have two amazing daughters, Elena, who's 10, and Sophie, who's 8. Lila, a year older than me, works as the personal secretary to Henry Carter, the president of the same company where I work. Funny enough, we tied the knot before she ever joined the firm. But when she lost her previous job, I suggested she apply. There were a few hoops to jump through because of the company's policies on family hires, but they made an exception, given my reputation. Henry Carter was in need of a solid assistant, and with her background working for a major corporation, Lila was an ideal match. After a quick interview, Henry offered her the position right on the spot. Now, Ethan Holloway and Liam Preston, the two who'd been doing the whispering, are insurance specialists too, though they focus on corporate clients and wealthy individuals. We're not exactly close friends, but we know each other through David Langston, a mutual acquaintance and a good friend of mine. My boss is technically Henry Carter, but I often get assignments from David on the side. A week after that party, though, everything changed. One night, I overheard something that turned my stomach. I ducked into the restroom for a quick break when, out of nowhere, Ethan and Liam strolled in, paying no mind to the closed stall door. They started chatting like they were the only two people in the world. Ethan wasted no time launching into a story about his latest conquest, a tale that made a deep knot form in my gut, way worse than any stomachache. Liam sounded almost shocked and asked how Ethan had managed to seduce her, since he never would have pegged her as the type. Ethan laughed it off, explaining they'd danced a bit, and she was friendly. When he'd suggested they slip off to his office, she brought up that Lucas wouldn't like it, but somehow he convinced her to join him for a drink at the bar instead. Then Ethan got to the part where he really started working his plan. He bragged about slipping a double shot into her drink without her noticing. Just wanted to help her relax, he chuckled, talking about how he'd planned to get closer to her on the dance floor. Liam pointed out the obvious risk, given that I was right there, but Ethan said he hadn't expected me to leave so soon. It was just good luck. I told Lila I needed to step outside for a bit, and though she'd suggested I take her home first, I reassured her I'd only be gone for a few minutes. She reluctantly stayed back with Ethan, David, and David's wife. Ethan went on, saying he got her another drink and, without her noticing, made it another double. He described how, as they kept dancing, she got more and more tipsy, laughing and clinging to him. Apparently, she'd pressed herself up against him a few times, which only encouraged him to keep up the drinks. Ethan boasted that after a couple more, she was feeling pretty wobbly, so he suggested stepping out for some fresh air. She agreed, and they wound up in the back seat of his car. He kept going, recounting every awful detail. He said she was nearly passed out, and yet she'd leaned into him, asking for more. Ethan even claimed she'd begged him to keep going and seemed to enjoy it. He laughed, saying he never would have guessed Lila, of all people, would go along with something like that. He even told Liam he had a follow-up date planned with her for the next Saturday when she usually went to the salon. He'd set up a plan for them to meet, get a hotel room, and spend the day together. Liam, clearly envious, remarked on how attractive Lila was and mused about what I could have done to deserve her. He even hinted at the idea of meeting her himself, once Ethan was done with her. Ethan just shrugged, laughing, but reminded Liam to keep things quiet, saying they didn't need any problems. Finally, they left the restroom, leaving me to process the gut-wrenching conversation I just overheard. Could this all be real? My mind drifted back to that night. It was around 11 p.m., and I'd been so sure everything was fine. Now I couldn't shake the dread filling my chest. When I got back to the party, I found Lila sitting with Ethan, Julie, and David Langston. She didn't look tipsy at all, just relaxed, chatting with Julie about the kids. Ethan stuck around long enough to make small talk with me before he left. I noticed Lila leaning over and whispering something to him as he got up, but I brushed it off. If anything seemed off that night, it was only when we got home. Lila wanted to be close, really close. Not that it was totally out of character, but it was unusual for her to be that passionate, especially so late. I couldn't shake the feeling it was more than just affection, like maybe she was feeling guilty about something. A week drifted by after that night, and life went back to normal. Lila's behavior didn't change at all. She was her usual self, and she never brought up the fact that I'd left the party early or mentioned anything strange from that night. When I asked about it, she said she danced with Ethan and David a bit, but mostly just watched everyone else, especially after I left. She said she and Julie chatted about school stuff and the kids' activities, and that was pretty much it. Lila even added that she would have preferred to come home when I left. Her tone was almost like a hint, like she wanted me to think I should keep a closer eye on her or something. "Do you have plans this Saturday?" I asked casually one evening. "I was thinking of heading out for a round of golf if you don't need me around." "Oh, right after lunch, I'll be at the salon," she answered, as if it was no big deal. "Shouldn't take more than an hour, maybe an hour and a half." "Where are you headed?" "Probably the golf course," I said, trying to sound casual even though I felt a knot forming in my stomach. How could Ethan have known about her Saturday plans if she hadn't told him? I hadn't even known about it until now. The whole thing felt like a bad joke, but I kept my tone light, thinking about the country club. Maybe I'll see if Liam Preston wants to join. He and David are usually up for a game. Lila raised an eyebrow and let out a little laugh. "Don't you think Liam and David are idiots?" she said dismissively. "Well, I know David well enough, but I don't know Liam or his wife enough to say," I replied, trying to keep the conversation steady. I shifted the topic slightly. "What about Ethan Holloway? You talked to him at the party, right? Maybe he'd like to come along." Lila shot me a look, and there was a pause. "Why would you invite him?" she asked, wrinkling her nose. "Pardon my language, but he's an idiot. I had to dance with him a couple of times, and he really creeped me out. He's still an idiot." I watched her carefully. Was she trying to put me off the idea of inviting him? Or was she trying to convince me that she didn't like him? Either way, it wasn't like her to talk down about someone like that. "Oh, I don't know him that well. Just know he's friends with Liam. And they seem pretty close," I replied, acting like I was letting the idea go. "But maybe it's not the best choice. I'll just see if Sam and Owen are free. They're always up for a game." She nodded, her tone lightening. "Yeah, that sounds like a better plan. Stay clear of Ethan. You don't want to bring any trouble around here." Her relief was obvious, but I couldn't ignore the strange, unsettled feeling growing inside me. "All right, Ethan's off the list," I said. "So, are you good with me going golfing?" "Of course," Lila replied, a little smile playing on her lips. "I'll still be at the salon anyway. How about we do dinner at Cypress Inn afterward? I'll have a fresh haircut, you'll have had your golf time, and then you can take me out and show me off," she teased. "I'll drop Sophie and Elena at my parents' place, so we can just enjoy the night." I agreed, and we set a plan. Meet back home around 5:30 on Saturday to get ready. Thinking back, I realize now that if I'd been more cautious, I might have had enough evidence to confront her right then and there. It would have been fitting, too, laying it all out over dinner at one of the best spots in town. The next day at work, I made my way to the control room to gather what I'd need to track Lila and her friend. I planned to borrow one of the company's surveillance vans and leave it parked until Saturday morning. I took a couple of transmitters small enough for her purse and car, and a GPS unit that would pinpoint her exact location. That way, I'd be able to keep tabs on her without even needing to be nearby. The van had video equipment, but with Ethan's mention of a motel, filming was out of the question. Maybe I could hide a camera in her jacket, but only if I knew for sure she'd wear it. The GPS would do, though. I'd be able to track her position within a 30-meter range, and the audio transmitters would pick up any conversations if she happened to use the van. It was all automated. Once set, I wouldn't even need to be present. With the plan in place, I spent the rest of the week keeping a close eye on things. Since tracking was my profession, this wasn't unfamiliar territory. I watched Ethan and Liam, but neither seemed to do anything suspicious. Normally, I'd check in on Lila at least once a day, but lately, I'd found excuses to stop by more often, just to see if anything felt off. So far, there was nothing to raise any red flags. Still, I decided to dig a little. One afternoon, I struck up a conversation with Liam, hoping he'd let something slip. He told me he'd been working on policies for a big factory complex, and it looked like he'd been busy drafting plans to cover potential disasters, a part of the risk insurance process called risk analysis. That Tuesday, I casually approached his desk, which was across from Ethan's. Liam was deep into his work, and I greeted him, asking if he was ready to review the Baxter plant plans. At first, he seemed distracted, but when he realized what I was asking, he nodded, saying he was available any time. He mentioned he still needed to get back to the location to take some photos, so we agreed to head out in about an hour. He'd swing by my desk when he was ready, and we'd go from there. Every step felt like I was closing in, but I knew I had to be careful. As I rounded the corner, I caught a smirk shared between Liam and Ethan. They didn't look away, keeping their eyes on me until I'd passed out of sight. I'd already found them intriguing, but this sealed it. Liam would face consequences too. Even if he hadn't been the main player, he'd stood by, egging Ethan on, knowing full well what had gone down. In my book, that made him just as guilty. An hour later, as planned, Liam showed up, and we headed out in my SUV. While he wasn't looking, I discreetly set up a small transmitter in the console. This device would pick up and record any conversation in or around the car, giving me a clear record of everything he'd say. As we left the parking lot and settled into the 25-minute drive to Baxter, I figured I'd ease him into things. "So, did you enjoy the party last week?" I asked casually. "Oh, I wasn't there. I was away on a trip," he replied quickly, "missed out on all the fun." I glanced over at him, barely hiding my skepticism. Funny thing is, I've heard some interesting stories about that night, especially involving Ethan and, well, my wife. I waited, watching his reaction. Liam's face went pale. He looked like he wanted to bolt. His hand even twitched toward the door handle. But after a second, he composed himself and looked back at me. "Look, I only know what Ethan told me afterward. I'm not even sure if it's true," he admitted, his voice uneasy. I kept my gaze steady. "Do you really think Ethan would make up a story like that?" I pressed. Liam hesitated, then shrugged. "Hard to say. But why would he lie? He told me he got her drunk and took her out to his car. And how would you know that if you weren't even there?" I asked, pushing him a little further. Liam's face showed his discomfort, but after a moment he sighed. "Ethan told me the whole story later," he muttered. "He mentioned your 2-hour absence and how that lined up perfectly for his, plan." I nodded, mentally filing away every bit of info he let slip. This was just the beginning. I needed to keep digging to get the full story. I wanted to know every detail, no matter how much it hurt. Liam's discomfort grew as he spoke, and he seemed almost unsure of the truth himself. He repeated what Ethan had told him, throwing in the occasional doubt as if to distance himself from it. I bit back a sarcastic remark about his loyalty. "Some friend you are, keeping all this quiet," I said, my tone cold. I'd think you'd at least give me a heads up. He looked down, clearly feeling guilty. I'm sorry, he muttered. I wouldn't wish this situation on anyone, Lucas. And believe me, Ethan's bragging made me feel sick. But he said he just couldn't resist her. At that, I shut off the recorder. We'd be having another, more private conversation soon. But for now, I had what I needed. I looked Liam straight in the eye, telling him that as long as he followed my instructions, he'd be fine. But I didn't mince words about the serious consequences if he slipped up. He nodded, clearly uneasy. I then hinted that there was something else I needed to address. I made it crystal clear that Ethan must never know about our conversation, and under no circumstances was Liam to breathe a word of this to him. If he did, he could expect consequences far beyond just losing his job. I'd see to it that his reputation was done for. I reminded him that I had ways of keeping tabs on both of them and could catch any misstep he made. I assured him that I wouldn't confront Ethan directly and that, for now, all I wanted him to do was keep acting normal and let Ethan talk freely without interference. Stick to my instructions, and everything will be fine, I told him. After that, we barely spoke during the rest of the 2-hour trip. He did his job and I did mine, gathering what I needed without letting him in on the full plan. Liam didn't need to know everything. Yet, the rest of the week crawled by with me keeping a close eye on Lila. She wasn't acting suspiciously, but I stayed on high alert, watching her every move. By Wednesday evening, the kids were off at their dance class, which ended around 9:30. I was flipping through channels in the living room when Lila came over, settling herself onto my lap. She wrapped her arms around my neck, her cheek pressed against mine. We've got about 2 hours before I have to pick up the kids, she murmured, her voice soft and inviting. How about we make love? Despite everything, my anger, my frustration, I felt a familiar pull. She was still my wife, and even with all my suspicions, I was still human. Ignoring my better judgment, I felt myself giving in, pulling her close and kissing her deeply. Take me upstairs right now, she whispered urgently, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that was hard to resist. Without a word, I followed her to our bedroom, admiring her as she led the way. We undressed, and the next moments were a blur of intense, passionate lovemaking. For a while afterward, we lay tangled together in the quiet, just breathing, holding onto the warmth between us. I wanted to believe it was all just a nightmare I'd wake up from. That was amazing, darling, she whispered, resting her head on my shoulder. We need to do this more often, don't you think? Feels like we've been out of sync lately. Let's not let that happen again. I nodded, doing my best to keep the moment light. You're right. I'll make sure of it, I said softly. How much time do we have? Enough for a quick shower? She smiled. I need to pick up the kids around 9:30, but we could stall for a bit. Or we could save it for Saturday night after our date. She paused, then added, I could ask my parents if the kids can spend the night. Wouldn't you like to have me all to yourself? I managed to smile, feeling the weight of everything pressing down. How about this, I said, trying to sound easygoing. Saturday night? I'm all yours. For the evening? I repeated, trying to keep things casual. So, anything else planned for Saturday? Well, let's see, she said, ticking off the schedule. You've got golf, I've got my hair appointment, then we have our dinner date. And after that, I'm all yours. Anytime, anywhere, however you want, she teased, flashing a grin. Unless you've got a better offer? None at all, I replied, smiling back, trying to keep my own doubts hidden. All right, then we're set. She quickly dressed, grabbed her keys, and headed out to pick up the kids. I stayed behind, lying there, turning everything over in my mind. How could she act this way, so affectionate, so convincing, if she really was involved with Ethan Holloway? Sure, I knew she was clever, but this was another level. It didn't add up, and I was more determined than ever to get to the bottom of it. On Saturday, while she was out, I double-checked the transmitters, confirming they were all set to go. I'd slip one into her purse and another in her car on Friday night. Everything was ready. I just needed one last piece of the puzzle. I had to know exactly where Ethan had planned to meet her, And if Liam wouldn't give up that info willingly, I was prepared to take things up a notch. The next morning, I called Liam and set up a meeting in the third-floor cafeteria. He showed up quickly, joining me at the table without a word. I got straight to the point. Liam, I need you to find out exactly where Ethan plans to take Lila on Saturday. I want the motel's name and location. I paused, giving him a hard look. Catch him alone and act like you're suspicious of him. Tell him you feel like he's hiding something. Say you'll trust him if he gives you the details. Liam hesitated, clearly nervous. The fear of what might happen if he refused was written all over his face, though, and eventually, he nodded in agreement. How will you know if I'm telling the truth? He asked, sounding worried. Don't worry. I've got my ways, I assured him. As he stood up to leave, I discreetly slipped a transmitter under the collar of his jacket. He was so on edge, he didn't even notice. Back in my office, I activated the receiver and listened as he returned to his desk. Not long after, I heard him invite Ethan to meet him in the copy room in 10 minutes, and Ethan agreed without hesitation. A few minutes later, Liam started talking, opening with a question about Ethan's marriage. Ethan sounded defensive, claiming everything was fine and mentioning he'd just seen me the day before and that I'd seemed just fine. But Liam wasn't satisfied. He pressed a bit harder, casually bringing up Ethan's plans with my wife and dropping a specific question about a motel. Ethan, caught off guard but eager to prove his point, offered proof of his honesty. He admitted he'd booked a room for them at the Skyview Motel on Statler Street for Saturday night, with check-in scheduled for 2 p.m. Hearing that, I knew I finally had what I needed. Ethan, in his smug way, confirmed that my wife would be meeting him around 2:15 p.m. He even had the nerve to suggest Liam call the motel himself to double-check if he didn't believe it. After sharing the details, Ethan tossed in a cheap shot about my marriage, warning Liam to stay out of their arrangement. Despite his apparent discomfort, Liam nodded, clearly shaken, but Ethan seemed totally unbothered, saying if my wife was interested, he was too. Listening to this exchange, I felt a mix of disbelief and fury. I'd half-hoped Ethan would confess to making it all up, but he only confirmed my worst fears. With a heavy feeling in my chest, I shut off the receiver. Now that I had the motel's address, my next step was clear. I'd set up surveillance in the van and collect enough proof to confront them both. My plan was to park the van near the motel on Friday night, activate the gear at noon on Saturday, and keep my distance. I didn't want to see this in person, but I needed undeniable evidence. To be thorough, I decided to call the motel myself. They confirmed that Ethan had indeed booked a room for Saturday afternoon, which only added to the sinking feeling in my gut. At this point, all I could do was wait until Friday night. Then, an idea struck me: why not capture them entering the motel room on camera? It would give me exactly the proof I needed. That afternoon, I drove to the Skyview Motel to scout things out. The place was run down and dimly lit, which suited my needs perfectly. I stepped into the office, where a shady-looking clerk was manning the desk. This was good. I didn't need honesty right now. I needed cooperation. "Hello, friend," I said, flashing my ID with a fake warrant I'd prepared. "I'm an insurance investigator, and I need a bit of information." I handed him a small stack of cash to seal the deal. The clerk's eyes widened, and he nodded. "Sure. What do you need?" "Ethan Holloway's reservation," I said. "I need the room number." He skimmed through the records and shook his head. "No room assigned yet." "Well," I replied, sliding another $50 across the counter, "how about putting him in a first-floor room overlooking Statler Street?" He hesitated, eyeing the cash, then nodded and wrote down a room number. "Perfect. By the way," I added, "I'll have a van parked on your lot. Just ignore it." He shrugged, pocketing the cash with a sly grin that told me he'd keep his mouth shut. As I walked out, I finalized my plan in my mind. I'd park the van right outside their room, set up the camera in the front window, and catch everything I needed from a distance. Friday was tough. My mind was spinning with everything I'd set in motion. To distract myself, I swung by Henry Carter's office, under the pretense of discussing a recent art gallery robbery. The details weren't urgent, but really, I wanted a glimpse of Lila. As I walked down the hallway toward the office, I couldn't shake the storm of emotions inside me. Anger, sadness, and, worst of all, the quiet dread of what I might see the next day. Walking down the hallway, I saw Lila's face light up when she spotted me. She waved, and as I came over to her table, she tilted her head playfully. "You've been around a lot more lately. Not that I'm complaining, but what's up? Anything I should know about?" "Oh, nothing much," I replied with a casual smile. "Just enjoying being around you more." I nodded toward Henry's office. "Is he in?" "Yep," she said, grinning. "Want me to introduce you?" "If you don't mind. I need to go over some things with him about the art gallery case," I explained. Inside, I chatted with Henry for a while. Despite his young age, he'd built quite a reputation. He was sharp, strategic, and had a significant stake in the company. His wife, Arya, blonde, slender, and stunning, fit the classic trophy wife image. She and Lila were around the same age and often chatted at company events. Henry and I had developed a good rapport, so I felt comfortable steering the conversation in a personal direction. "By the way, Henry, what do you think of Ethan Holloway?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Normally, I only give feedback on employees in a formal review, but this was different. Henry raised an eyebrow, clearly curious. "Why the interest? Something I should know?" I shrugged. "Just doing my part to ensure my team stays solid," I said. "But yeah, I do have some concerns about Ethan, and Liam too, to be honest. I might have more to share after the weekend, depending on how things go." "All right," Henry nodded thoughtfully. "How about you drop by my place on Sunday? If you're not free, we can talk Monday." I nodded. "Sounds good. But let's keep this between us for now. Of course, I trust your judgment. You're always fair with these things." He paused, then gave me a serious look. "Speaking of which, I'd like you to think about that VP position I proposed. I haven't discussed it with Lila yet, but she deserves to know soon. If you don't tell her, I'll need to." I met his eyes, giving a short nod. "I just want to find the right time. It's a big step for us, and I wanted to think it over. But I'll give you an update next week." Henry leaned back, giving me a supportive smile. "Fair enough. Take your time and weigh your options. We'll catch up soon." Leaving his office, I exchanged a few words with Lila before heading over to Liam's desk. As I approached, I made a loud remark about Baxter's performance, ensuring Ethan, who was nearby, could hear me. Then, as I passed by Liam, I gave him a subtle signal, letting him know I was fully aware of his conversation with Ethan. Liam's eyes widened in surprise, but he kept quiet. I patted him on the back, casually slipping my hand up to retrieve the tiny transmitter without him noticing. Wrapping up the day without any interruptions, I waited for Lila so we could head home together. I planned to tell her that I'd be delayed because I needed to drop off the van. She kissed me goodbye, her smile soft and unsuspecting, then headed for the door. As she walked out, I noticed Ethan standing by the entrance, watching her leave with an expression that made my blood run cold. As I headed for the door, I noticed Ethan glance over briefly before turning back to his seat. With that, I made my way to the van, parked it discreetly near the motel, and adjusted the camera to capture a clear view of the room the clerk had reserved. I double-checked everything, making sure it was secure, then found the motel owner to remind him that the van would need to stay there overnight, maybe even into the next day. I slipped him an extra $20, and he nodded, pocketing the cash with a grin as we shook hands to seal our agreement. Returning home that Friday night, I walked into an unexpected surprise. Lila had ordered pizza for the kids and arranged for them to spend the evening with her parents. When I asked her why, she gave me a playful smile. "I really enjoyed Wednesday night," she said, "and I thought we could keep that going. You don't mind, do you?" "Not at all," I replied, trying to keep my own feelings in check. As the night unfolded in a way that mirrored Wednesday's, a strange, gnawing feeling started creeping up on me. Even though we were having a great time, I couldn't shake the sense of unease. She'd even introduced a few new techniques, and I couldn't help but wonder where she'd learned them. Later, when I casually asked about it, she giggled, reached over to her nightstand, and handed me a book. It was an article about keeping the spark alive after 35, filled with tips and techniques. Apparently, that was the source of her recent enthusiasm. We spent the night wrapped up in each other, and I did my best to meet her newfound energy. As we lay beside each other, I finally mustered up the courage to ask, "Lila, I love what we've been doing, and I want to make you happy, but I have to ask, what sparked all this? Why now? If I didn't know you better, I might think there's a guilty conscience at play." She looked at me, a bit taken aback, and then laughed softly. "Sorry, Lucas. Actually, Arya told me something last week that got me thinking. I can't tell you exactly what she said, but it made me reflect on us and realize how happy I am. Sometimes I just feel like showing you how much you mean to me," she explained, her eyes full of sincerity. As I listened, a mix of emotions swirled through me. If she was telling the truth, how could she possibly be involved with someone else? I took a deep breath. "I'm glad you feel that way. But are you sure I make you happy? Are you satisfied with what we have? Or do you feel like something's missing? Be honest," I urged, searching her face. She squeezed my hand. "Lucas, I love our closeness, and you've always made me feel complete. I don't want anything more. I just don't want our passion to fade into routine. I want to feel that you desire me, that you'll always want me." I pulled her closer. "You'll never have to worry about that. I love you, and I always will. I can't imagine anything threatening what we have." She smiled, nestling closer. "That's good to hear, because I won't let anything come between us." She pressed herself against me, and we spent the rest of the night wrapped in each other's arms, waking up the same way. But as content as I looked lying beside her, my mind was already turning toward Saturday's plan. Still pleasantly exhausted, I woke up beside Lila, feeling the urge to share a warm shower with her. I gently woke her, pulling her into the bathroom. At first, she protested, grumbling about needing more sleep, but soon enough, she joined me under the warm spray, and we started tending to each other. Before long, our passion reignited, and we gave in to each other once again, letting the hot water wash over us. As we finished, she mentioned that she was ready for the day but hinted with a smile that she was expecting more later that night. After getting dressed, I drove to the motel to finalize my setup. I programmed the timers to activate at exactly 1 p.m. and ensured the audio recording would run for at least 5 hours. The video footage would be compressed and burned onto a DVD, a process that would take about 7 hours to cover the entire day. I double-checked everything and locked up the van. Once these two stepped into their so-called sanctuary, they'd be the stars of their very own film. The first screening, I figured, would be unforgettable. I headed back home to grab my golf clubs and say goodbye to Lila. My day on the golf course turned out to be a disaster. I was completely off my game. I played with a couple of guys from the club and botched almost every shot. By the end, I felt like a failure, so I bought beers for everyone to drown my frustration. Around 5, I drove to the van to ensure everything was in order. The area was quiet, and there was no sign of activity. I scanned the lot, saw no unfamiliar cars, and assumed everyone had cleared out. A quick call home confirmed that Lila was there, and I let her know I'd be back soon. As the time to meet her for dinner approached, I headed home, deciding to hold off on reviewing the surveillance footage just yet. I wanted to confront her with the evidence at some point, but I also wanted to savor one last evening together, even if my heart felt heavy. Despite everything, I still found comfort in being with her. Even though her betrayal was weighing on me, I loved her deeply, and the thought of losing her made my throat tighten. Why was she doing this? The idea of life without her seemed unbearable. If the evidence proved my suspicions, then divorce was unavoidable. Her behavior was unacceptable. But then, what about our children? She was a wonderful mother and deserved to be with them, despite whatever mistake she might have made. I told myself I could live with that. I could support her and make sure she and the kids were taken care of. These thoughts swirled in my mind as I drove home, unsure if I could keep my composure through the evening. I knew I couldn't take any action until I had hard evidence, but doubts kept tugging at me. I shook them off, soon I'd know the truth. When I arrived, Lila was already showered and dressed, mentioning she'd add the finishing touches closer to our reservation time. I hurried to get ready, making sure we'd leave on time. I couldn't help but admire how radiant she looked. As always, she was effortlessly stunning, and it only made my heart ache even more. As we walked into the restaurant, Lila drew attention without even trying. She brushed off the admiring glances from others, but I couldn't help feeling a surge of pride. Tonight was a stark reminder of what could have been. The kind of woman she was, intelligent and engaging, always a captivating dinner companion. We chatted over a variety of topics, just like any other night out, and I noticed she was indulging in a little more wine than usual. As the designated driver, I kept my eye on her, feeling both flattered and uneasy as she became increasingly flirtatious. By the time we'd finished dessert, chocolate mousse and sorbet, we shared a smile, both eager to call it a night and head home. I signaled the waiter for the check as Lila excused herself to the restroom. When she returned, we headed out to the car, and as I navigated the main road toward home, she leaned against me, intertwining our fingers. She guided my hand down to her lap, and, without much prompting, I pulled her close. It was like we were back in the early days, when that simple embrace meant everything. She sighed happily, and we drove home in comfortable silence, wrapped in each other's warmth. Once we got home, Lila moved around with endless energy, tidying up and taking care of a few things around the house. Finally, she turned to me with a mischievous glint in her eye. "Shouldn't we head upstairs and pick up where we left off this morning? You owe me, remember?" "Absolutely," I replied, forcing myself to match her enthusiasm despite the turmoil brewing inside me. Upstairs, we moved quickly, anticipation building between us. Lila stood by the bed, watching me intently as I stripped down to just my boxers and socks. She slipped off her top and bra, leaving only a delicate strand of pearls around her neck. When she reached up to take them off, I stopped her. "Leave them on," I said softly. "You look incredible with just those pearls. This is a sight only I get to see." I pulled her close, letting myself get lost in the moment. "I'm completely yours tonight," she smiled, her voice a mixture of seduction and sincerity. "I'm all yours." In that moment, I wanted desperately to believe her. I decided to set aside my doubts, at least for the night, and focus on the present. What followed was a night of unexpected discovery, where we explored new realms of intimacy, trying things we hadn't before. She laughed, playfully referencing pages from that book whenever I asked about her fantasies. It was intense, almost surreal, like we were reconnecting on a level I hadn't thought possible. We fell asleep wrapped around each other and woke up late Sunday morning, reluctant to leave the warmth of each other's arms. She suggested one more round of our favorite moments from the night before, and I happily obliged. Afterward, she had to pick up the girls, and I casually mentioned needing to check on the van. She suggested staying at her mom's for a while, which gave me the perfect chance to retrieve the tapes and see what they'd captured. Once she left, I headed straight to the van to collect the evidence that would finally reveal the truth. I gathered all the recordings, returned the van to the production facility, and called a taxi to take me back to my car. Once I was finally home, the first thing I did was examine the GPS printout. My heart sank as I saw the confirmation in black and white. Lila's car had indeed been parked at the motel on Statler Street. The reality of it hit me hard, but I needed to see the video for myself. Bracing for the inevitable, I turned on the TV, popped the DVD into the player, and prepared to have my worst fears confirmed. The image came up crystal clear, with the motel room perfectly centered on the screen. I fast-forwarded until I saw a car pull up and slowed the playback. Ethan Holloway stepped out, unlocked the door, and disappeared inside. I rewound slightly, watching as another car appeared on the screen, and a woman approached, knocking on the door. Ethan opened it with a welcoming grin, and she stepped inside. When she turned, and I saw her face, my heart pounded, my pulse surging. I paused the video, staring at the screen, then watched the entire sequence from beginning to end. Finally, I shut off the player, pulling out the DVD. Well, I'll be damned, I muttered to myself. I needed to act. My first step was to confirm something else. so I retrieved Lila's address book from my desk drawer. Sure enough, the address I was looking for was there, confirming my suspicions. A grim, determined smile crept onto my face. With everything I needed in hand, I dialed Henry Carter's home number, urging him to meet me right away. He wanted me to come to his house, but I convinced him to meet me somewhere private. Eventually, we agreed to rendezvous at the TGIF restaurant near the office. An hour later, we sat in a quiet corner booth at TGIF. Lila and the girls were having dinner with her mom, giving me the time and privacy I needed. I laid out the situation to Henry, watching his face turn from disbelief to anger as he absorbed each detail. At first, he was visibly skeptical, outright denying the possibility of Lila's involvement. But as I played the audio recording of Liam's conversation with Ethan, his doubt began to crumble. When I finished recounting the full story, implicating both Liam and Ethan, Henry's face flushed red with rage. To drive the point home, I handed him the portable DVD player I'd brought, complete with a 9-inch screen and headphones for privacy. "Take a look at this," I said, "and then judge for yourself." Reluctantly, Henry put on the headphones and started the video. I could see his expression shift from disbelief to a pained understanding as he watched. Sensing he needed a moment, I looked away, giving him the space to process what he was seeing. When he finally finished, he met my gaze, waiting for my response, his face still tense with emotion. Once he'd collected himself, I spoke calmly but firmly. "Henry, I want them both terminated for breaching the moral clause in their contracts. Effective by Monday afternoon. You have all the evidence you need to act, and I trust you'll handle it accordingly. This is the last I'll say on the matter." Henry's initial shock gave way to a resolute determination, and I could see he understood the weight of what needed to be done. Henry gave me a firm nod. "You have my word, Lucas. This will be handled first thing Monday. I'll personally escort them off the premises. They're dead to me. There may be further actions I'll take, but it's best if you don't know the details." "Understood," I replied, meeting his gaze. I handed him a bag containing all the surveillance data, except for one small cassette I kept for my own purposes, essential for my plans regarding Lila. Henry and I discussed a few final details, making additional decisions about how to address the fallout later in the week. We shook hands, and just before I left, he stopped me. "Lucas," he said, his tone sincere, "you've handled this with remarkable integrity and composure. I admire how level-headed you've been through all of this. It prevented things from escalating. You have my gratitude and respect." Hearing that, I felt a sense of relief as I headed home to my family, who remained blissfully unaware of the storm coming their way. That evening, everything went smoothly. My spirits were surprisingly high, and Lila's curiosity was evident. She asked what had happened, but I simply told her she'd learn more at work the next day. We were both tired from the past few nights, so we turned in early. She wanted to be held, and I was happy to oblige. We fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, just like before. On Monday morning, work was a whirlwind. Around 9:30, Lila called, her voice tinged with urgency. "Lucas, you won't believe what's happening." Henry's called both Liam Preston and Ethan Holloway into his office. "They're in there now, and it's tense." Feigning cluelessness, I asked, "What's going on?" "Henry's furious," she whispered. "He's called security," she added before hanging up, promising to keep me posted. About 20 minutes later, she called again, excitement and disbelief clear in her voice. "Security just escorted Liam and Ethan out. They're fired. Henry wants me to draft their termination letters citing a breach of the moral clause." She paused, sounding almost breathless. "This is the most unusual thing I've ever seen in this job." "We'll talk over lunch," I replied, keeping my tone steady. When we met for lunch, Lila couldn't contain herself as she recounted the events of the morning. She described in vivid detail how security had marched Liam and Ethan out of the building, warning them never to return. She even mentioned how tense Henry had been, snapping at her in a rare moment before quickly apologizing. Eventually, her curiosity got the better of her, and she turned to me, searching for answers. "Henry told me to ask you," she said, narrowing her eyes playfully. When I pressed him for details, all he said was, "Ask Lucas. He knows everything," and opened my eyes to a lot, "So spill it." I leaned in, choosing my words carefully. "All right, before I say anything, I want you to hear something." I slid a cassette across the table to her, containing the damning conversation between Liam and Ethan about the motel. Her face turned serious as she took it, sensing there was much more to the story than she'd imagined. Lila listened intently, her face turning pale as she reached the end of the recording. She yanked off the headphones, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "This is absurd. It's a lie. I never went to any motel with him, and I never would. You can't honestly trust this recording. Did you show this to Henry? Does he believe this nonsense too?" "No," I replied calmly. "He doesn't believe Ethan. And neither do I." I could see her relaxing just a little, but I kept my tone steady. "But I need to explain what's going on, and I need you to hear me out. All right?" Lila nodded, though she was still visibly shaken. "About a week ago, I overheard a conversation between Liam and Ethan," I began. "Ethan was bragging to Liam, claiming he'd gotten you intoxicated at a party and, well, took you out to his car. He got explicit, and Liam seemed to believe him. So much that he even hinted he'd like to get in on the next encounter." Lila's eyes flashed with anger, but I held up a hand. "Let me finish." I continued. "I had to know the truth. So I asked Liam to press Ethan for details. Ethan admitted he'd booked a motel room on Statler Street for Saturday afternoon, right during your hair appointment. That raised a red flag. How did he know about your appointment, unless you told him?" "I didn't tell him anything," she protested. "I was at the salon, like I said. My salon is on Statler Street, but I had no idea about any motel plans." You do believe me, right?" "I do believe you, Lila," I reassured her, reaching for her hand. "But I had to confirm things, so I used a company surveillance van to keep an eye on the motel room and record anyone who came or went. I checked the footage Sunday. A woman did visit Ethan. But it wasn't you." Lila's eyes widened in shock. "Then who was it?" I took a deep breath. "It was Arya, Henry's wife. I suspected something was off after I talked to David Langston, who mentioned you and Julie were drinking only soft drinks and stayed together most of the night. Even Julie noticed that you'd asked her to stay close to avoid Ethan's advances. That's when I realized Ethan was spinning a story to cover up his real companion." Lila looked stunned, her eyes filling with relief and hurt at the same time. "So, you really doubted me? Did you seriously set up surveillance on me?" "Lila," I said softly, "I didn't doubt you. I doubted Ethan's story, but I had to get to the truth, and unfortunately, that truth implicated Henry's wife." I paused, squeezing her hand. "Henry was devastated when I told him." Reluctantly, Lila accepted my explanation, though I could see she was hurt. Even so, I didn't regret uncovering the truth. If anything, it had strengthened my resolve to protect our relationship and to make sure this kind of deception never came between us again. The rest of the day passed in a blur of normal routines. Late in the afternoon, Lila mentioned that Henry wanted to speak with her privately. She seemed to buy my feigned ignorance, but at dinner that night, amidst the usual family chaos, she found a quiet moment to share what Henry had said. He talked about trust, respect, and love in a marriage, she explained, her voice low. He shared how devastating it is to lose all of that. She paused, her gaze distant, before meeting my eyes, silently searching for understanding. Lila's expression softened as she continued. "Henry confided in me about Arya and asked for my advice." "What did you tell him?" I asked, curious. "I encouraged him to think carefully about how much he loves Arya and, if he could, to consider forgiving her," she replied thoughtfully. "I told him he should have an honest conversation with her, but not drag out the decision if he thought things couldn't be mended. He seemed to take it to heart." "Did he mention anything about me?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Lila raised an eyebrow, picking up on my hint of hesitation. "No, not specifically." "Why?" "Well," I began, "Henry offered me a new position, Vice President of Investigations. It means I'd oversee all the investigators globally, with a considerable financial package, benefits, and shares. He even said we could choose to relocate to California or Florida, though I'd still report to him directly. Her face lit up, and she leapt into my arms, her excitement almost overwhelming. When did he offer you this? Is it because of everything that happened today? Actually, he offered it 6 months ago, I admitted, holding her close. I just wasn't ready to make a decision then. But this past week, thinking about what I could have lost, made it feel real. I realized I don't want to hold back anymore. Lucas, she whispered, gripping my shoulders tightly, you could never lose me like that. I'd never stray, it's just out of the question. Do you understand? I nodded, feeling her words wash over me, lifting the weight of the past week. We held each other, both relieved and grateful, as a renewed sense of purpose filled me. Our future felt clearer now, more grounded, and I knew we were in it together. Exhausted from the emotional roller coaster, we headed to bed early. Wrapped up in each other's arms, we fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, ready to face whatever came next, together.